Hi everyone, I've been doing some videos where I look back at 2020 and look at what I read. So I just posted a few days ago my worst and most disappointing reads of 2020, which was kind of a fun video to make. I got to be kind of negative and snarky. But today we're going to look at my favorite books from 2020. I think I read a lot of really good books in 2020, and it was hard to pick what I was going to go with for this video. So of course I looked back at my ratings and at everything I read this year, and I was trying to decide, should I do a top 10? Should I do a top 20? Because I'm sure, I definitely read 20 really good books this year, but that felt like a little bit too many. So instead, I decided what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about my top 6 books, and then I'm going to pick another 6 that are also really good books, and I'll just mention those. So I have sort of 2 tiers. And in the end, rather than looking at even what I gave the absolute highest rating or what I think is the absolute highest quality, the books that I went with for this list in terms of the best of 2020 to me are really the books that I feel like made the most emotional impact on me, and the ones that I feel like, looking back at the year, these are the ones that stuck with me the most. So there are some books that didn't make it into my top 6, but that I thought were really excellent books, so I'm going to try to mention some of those as well. I think there are probably some good books that I read this year that are not even going to be in this video at all, which is kind of hard because when I started planning, I just wanted to list every good book that I read this year so that, other people would know about them. But I am trying to self-edit a little bit somehow. So the first ever book that I reviewed on this channel was The Goblin Emperor by Katherine Addison, which I read for the first time this year. I've talked about it plenty already on this channel. This was a book that really surprised me. I decided to read it after seeing it around for quite a few years. I never really heard anyone talk about it. I didn't see a lot of mention of it, but I saw it on lists. It won a Hugo at one point, I think earlier in the year. I gave it a shot, and it turned out to be one of my all-time favorite books. There's just a lot that's really great about it, and I read it from the library, and I ended up buying a copy, and I've been recommending it. I don't think it's a book that everyone will love because it's a pretty slow-paced character study, but I just think there are a lot of things about it that are really phenomenal. I guess you can go watch my review if you want to know more about this book, but honestly, it's the first review I ever filmed, and maybe you shouldn't go watch that review because it's a little bit embarrassing now, but I still left it up. I haven't taken down any of my first videos. Maybe I'll decide to do that at some point, but right now it's still up. If you like fantasy that's a little bit literary or a little bit different, that isn't the most heavily plot-driven, that has a really good depth of world building, or that does interesting things with language, I think this is a really great choice. If you like things that are more plot-driven or action-y and you don't like things that feel slow, this is probably not a book for you. But I'm pretty sure this is going to stay one of my favorites for a very, very long time. And I will say that some of the people that I've recommended it to personally, they all liked it. I haven't had anyone dislike this book, but I have been very selective about who I recommend it to. And by the way, these top 6 are not going to be in any particular order because they're all different. They all mean something different to me. And so I don't want to have to rank them for this video. These are 6 books that I really loved. Number 2 won't be a surprise to anyone. It's behind me on the shelf. We have Rhythm of War. Hopefully I'm still in frame. I didn't want to dislodge that today to prepare for the video, so I just left it because I spent a while trying to get this Brandon Sanderson shelf to look nice, and I don't want to touch it for a couple more days. I mentioned I'm thinking of buying a bigger Way of Kings, and then I'll have to redo everything, but too much effort. Anyway, I spent the whole year gearing up for Rhythm of War, it feels like. I've been waiting for it for 3 years, so no big surprise that this is one of my favorites for the year. If you were going to read it, you probably have it, or you're probably waiting to read it. I don't think I need to say too much. I've mentioned in my spoiler-free review, I felt like it started out a little bit slow, but I was really blown away by the end, and I'm dying for the next one already, so it's going to be a long wait. Another book that I've been waiting for quite a long time is The Empire of Gold by S.A. Chakraborty. This is the 3rd book in the Daevabad trilogy, which has been a real obsession of mine for the past few years. Now that the trilogy is over, I think the obsession has, abated a little bit, but I was really waiting for this book, and it didn't let me down. I think in some ways it was the best one in the trilogy, which is rare. It's always a little bit scary being a fan of something that is not complete because you never know is the author gonna let you down or not at the end? So thankfully I did end up really loving this book. I think it had some of the best character work in the entire trilogy. I think her writing progressed a lot, I think, as the trilogy went along. I think basically the conclusions that were reached for the characters and the story were pretty satisfying. Basically, it was just a big relief to have the trilogy end in a way that I liked. Of course, not every single thing that you would like to have happen necessarily works with plot or reality, but overall, I was really, really happy with how this book went, and I really enjoyed it. Another book that became a new favorite for me this year, very unexpectedly, was Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir. I think this was maybe the second book I reviewed on this channel because I had just read it, I think, when I had started the channel. And I've talked before about how I really didn't even want to read it because the cover really scared me, because I've mentioned a lot, I don't like horror and dead things and creepy things very much at all, and I don't like body horror, and I don't like things that are gross. But I really loved this book, even though it's about necromancers. I can't say even that I would rank this in the top 6 best written books that I've read this year. Again, this is a book that's going to be for a very particular reader, but I normally wouldn't be that reader, and I absolutely loved this book. I loved the sense of humor. It verges on breaking the fourth wall at times even. It has just a very unique, hilarious protagonist that views the world in a very interesting way, but you really fall in love with her. Looking back at the year, I definitely have to put this in my top 6 just because, again, it's a book that really stuck with me. It had a lot of emotional impact. It was really funny. I loved it. I was so delighted by it the entire time that I was reading it. And I didn't reread it, but I kind of wish I had, and I probably will at some point next year. Oh, and also, like The Goblin Emperor, this is a book that I got from the library, and then I liked it so much that I bought a copy, so that's my highest form of praise for a book, I guess, is when I read it, because I get a lot of things from the library, read them on ebook on my phone. So I loved it so much that as soon as I finished reading it, I ordered a copy. So then picking the last couple books I was gonna put in my top 6 got really, really hard. But when I really thought about what was the most unique book that I read this year that I felt like I connected to the most, I had to go in the end with Senlin Ascends by Josiah Bancroft. This was a book that I started hearing a lot of buzz about over the summer on BookTube, and I was pretty excited to try reading it, but I didn't know a lot about it. And again, this was a book that really surprised me in a really good way. It's fantasy, but it's very different than a lot of the fantasy that you'll find. It has a very unique main character. The writing style is really beautiful, and this is just a book that stuck with me a lot. I still feel like I can remember how I felt while reading it. I still haven't read the 2 sequels that are out so far, which I feel really bad about, but I definitely am planning to do that next year. And I just feel like it's so different than anything else I've read, and it made such an impact on me. It was just so beautifully written in a lot of ways, especially in how the character is shown and just this really unique journey that he's on. So I felt like this had to go into my top 6. Number 6 is kind of going to be a strange choice for certain reasons. So again, when I thought back about the whole year and what books made the most impact on me, I had to go with The Raven Tower by Leckie. And the reason this is kind of a strange choice is, you might remember if you've been watching, this is the book that I read twice because I didn't like it the first time, but then immediately reread it and really loved it. So I still have really conflicting feelings about this book because it's a very strange book. It's fantasy, it's a standalone, it's basically a Hamlet retelling, but it's told in second person, and there's also another storyline taking place I guess in the past. See, I'm getting confused just talking about it. But the narrator who's telling the story to the main character is a god that's a rock, and so there's also a lot about the god telling its entire life story. I know that sounds weird. It's just a really unique book. It does some very interesting things. I feel like it sold me on second person even more than some of the second person I had read in the past. And thankfully, Harold the Ninth, the sequel to Gideon, came out around when I read The Raven Tower, and I felt really prepped to be reading second person at that point. But also, again, it's such a strange book, but it just has really stuck with me more than some of the other things that I think I even liked more while I was reading them. It's just really uniquely told. It's taking fantasy, it's really stretching what fantasy can be and how things can be done. So again, I think a lot of people probably shouldn't read this book, but again, I made my husband read it and he actually ended up really liking it. I think he liked it right off the bat more than I did. So those were my top 6. Those are just the books that had the most impact on me, the ones I feel like I'm going to remember things about them for the longest or want to reread, or just books that I feel like stick with me or mean a lot to me. But I want to mention a few more books that I thought were also really great, and that it was hard not to put them in the top, but I just felt like they maybe just didn't have as much impact on me compared to the ones that I chose. The first one, which again I've mentioned a few times but never did a review of, and I really regret this now because I had so much to say about it at the time, was The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. Ken Liu is really better known as a translator and a writer of short stories, but he has this epic fantasy series called The Dandelion Dynasty. The Grace of Kings is the first one, and it is very different. I listened to it on audiobook, which is unusual for me, and I'm glad that I did because I feel like I don't know if I would have had the patience for this book, weirdly, if I had read it, even though reading is faster than listening, at least for me. It's a book that is very epic in scope. It is set in a world that is very Chinese, but it's not like fantasy China. It's just drawing on China and, East Asian culture and traditions in general while being in a completely invented fantasy setting, which I think is just really interesting. But then he's also using actual Chinese legends and history for this book, and it feels very epic to read. It feels kind of historical. It feels almost like reading a classic. The reason that this isn't in my top 6 is because I feel like there was just this level of distance I had to the characters and the story based on the way he told the story. But I also really like the choices he made in this book, so, I had to weigh that. But I think if you don't mind things that feel a little bit impersonal and you like historical epics, or this sounds interesting to you, I think this is a really amazing book. Another book that was hard not to put in the top 6 was A Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. This is the book that ended up winning the Hugo Award this year. When I did my Hugo Awards reading project this year and I ended up ranking the finalists for best novel, in terms of my own preference, I ended up putting Gideon the Ninth first, and then I put A Memory Called Empire second. And I did love Gideon a lot more than I loved A Memory Called Empire, but I think that A Memory Called Empire, if I could say that a book deserves to win an award, because of course it's kind of very subjective, I think A Memory Called Empire really deserved to win the Hugo Award. I think it's a brilliantly crafted book. So much about it is so smart. It's a really interesting look at what happens when an outsider is in love with a conquering culture. It has a lot of vibes of ancient Rome and the Byzantine Empire, but also a little bit of an Aztec flavor, I guess. And it's science fiction. It has a bit of a murder mystery going on. It's a really interesting book. I loved it. It's just, I feel like I connected with it on a more intellectual level compared to an emotional level, and I felt like I wasn't that attached to the characters. I think some people felt more attached to the characters than I did, but I liked them, and I thought the character work was good, especially the main character and this really complicated relationship she had between her desire to serve her own people, but this kind of admiration and obsession with the culture that was in the process of subsuming or, attempting to conquer her own culture. And there was a really interesting exploration of the nature of memory. So overall, just a really great, fascinating, unique book. Totally deserved to win the Hugo. Really looking forward to reading the sequel, which is coming out early next year. This was definitely a favorite for me this year. Another book that for me just didn't quite make it into the top, but that I thought was great, was The Relentless Moon by Mary Robinette Kowal. This was the 3rd book in the Lady Astronaut series, and in some ways it was my favorite so far. It felt really timely because of certain events this year, both because it deals with a polio outbreak and also for some other, political reasons. It just felt kind of timely. I don't think the author intended it that way at all. It was a total coincidence because obviously books are written quite a while before they get released. This is my favorite book in the Lady Astronaut series so far. I really liked the main character. She is an older woman who is an astronaut and a political wife and has to balance both of those things. She's a very determined and confident character, and just very different than a lot of the women that get portrayed in fiction in a very good way. I thought it was the kind of character that I would love to see more of. And I just thought her perspective was really interesting. I really like how that character was written. There's just something about Mary Robinette Kowal's writing that I do not 100% connect with emotionally. And that has always been the case. I didn't enjoy her previous series all that much and stopped reading it. I have really enjoyed the Lady Astronaut series, but for me, there's some disconnect I have with her writing that stops me from totally loving it, and I'm not really sure why. But I thought that this was a really great book, and I'm looking forward to the continuation of this series as well. I have a few more favorites that I want to mention. These are all books that I haven't talked about too much on the channel, either because I read them very early in the year or just I didn't feel like doing a review for them. The first one is A Closed and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. Ironically, the book that comes after this in the Wayfarer series made it onto my least favorite and most disappointing books of the year, but this was my favorite in the Wayfarers series so far. The first book I liked, but this one I thought was more tightly focused, more interesting look at fewer characters. It's still, I guess none of her books have that much of a plot, but this was a really interesting look at an artificial intelligence that was originally the AI for a ship that got put into an artificial body and had to deal with basically becoming a person, or, having a body instead of being part of a ship, and what that was like. And then there was also a really powerful secondary narrative with the character that was helping her adapt to life not being a ship anymore. And that character had been through also some really intense life experiences as a child, and it was really interesting getting to learn that backstory. So I thought this was a really great book as well, and I feel like out of that whole series and just in general, it definitely made an impact on me. Another book that I really loved this year was This Tender Land by William Kent Krueger. I can't even remember why I picked this book up from the library still, and I had it out for so long. I think I checked it out 2 or 3 times before I actually read it, but it's set during the Great Depression. It has kind of a Mark Twain feel, at least in terms of that sort of historical exploring America story, where the characters really go on an odyssey of meeting different interesting characters along the road. And yeah, I guess it has a lot of Odyssey inspiration in general. You'll see why if you read it, but it's about 3 boys and then a little girl who escaped from a school that is one of those schools that was created for Native American children to re-educate them. That's really a horrible place, and they end up running away and going on this adventure. And it's a really powerful book in a lot of ways. It has definitely stuck with me since I read it, so I wanted to mention it as one of my favorites of the year. The last book I want to mention as a favorite from this year on my secondary list, I guess, was Sourdough by Sloan. I didn't love this quite as much as his first book, Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore, but I read this one in January, I think, and again, it's just a really sweet book. His books always seem to be set in the Bay Area, or, basically they deal with the intersection between Silicon Valley and tech, and then sort of other elements, whether it's literary or food or something like that. And there's always an element that feels kind of magical in them, but is not really quite fantasy. So I don't know, I've really enjoyed everything he's written so far. And this was before sourdough baking became kind of a thing in the moment. So I feel like it would be fun to revisit the book now that so many people took up, I don't know, are people still doing that though? Over the summer, everyone was baking sourdough. But this is a book about a young woman who's a programmer. She gets a high-powered job with a startup that is pretty awful, and she starts baking sourdough, except the sourdough starter is a very mysterious sourdough starter that might have some interesting properties. So that was a really fun book as well. Short and sweet, same as his other book. I hope he writes more soon because I find something just very nice and comforting and fun about his books. I always feel good after I read them. So those are now my best books of 2020, both my top 6 and then my next top 6. There are 2 things really I want to mention because I have to do honorable mentions, right? I'm apparently really bad at constraining myself to making a list. So first of all, I just want to mention the Winternight trilogy, which I didn't put in this top list because I did not read it for the first time this year. It's been coming out for a few years. I had read all the books as they were coming out, and I liked it, but I ended up rereading the books this year. I listened to them on audio over the last few months, and they just had such a powerful effect on me. They were just so beautifully written. They're set in medieval Russia, a lot of influence from Russian folklore. A lot of it is about the clash between the old believers and the rise of Christianity. And then there's a young woman who is sort of trying to make her way in this world who doesn't really fit into conventional women's roles for the time, but it's handled in a way that is, it's a little bit rough to read sometimes, but it's very believable. Like, it's not a cheesy story where she just somehow magically overcomes all the prejudices of the time. Definitely not. The very last book I want to mention in this video is actually a book that made it to my worst and most disappointing video, but I want to mention it again here because it was kind of both. And that is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. The reason this was on my worst of 2020 video, I had it in my what was I thinking category because it's a book that I really wanted to read that ended up just being way too horror heavy for me. But it was a beautifully written book. I couldn't put it down. I think she's an amazing writer, and if you like horror, you should really read it. So I just want to mention it because it was such a well done book, and I had a little bit of guilt for putting it in my worst and most disappointing video, even though it was sort of in the category of a book I should have known not to read. There are plenty of other books that I read this year that were awesome. I'm sorry I couldn't mention all of them, but I was trying to kind of restrain myself here. So those are some of the books that I think were the best of 2020. Those are the books that have stuck with me the most since I've read them, and the ones that I'm kind of predicting will stick with me the most going forward. So let me know what your favorites of 2020 were, so maybe I can put some of them, on my list to read in 2021, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video.